Today's a continuation of body image issues or body in general. And the reason why we decided to continue on this conversation is because there were a lot of great things that came out of the last time we did this. And I'm sorry, I keep hitting the table. I'm going to hear it from Brandon later. So there were a bunch of things. And one of the things that I thought was worth returning to was the idea of having safety in our body, like feeling calm within our body. And before we turned on the camera, I was telling Louis that what I think is interesting about body image issues, or like body image in general, is that what I think we're actually talking about are internal experiences that we create for ourselves based on the images that we put out for people. And I think a really good example of this, kind of the epitome of this, would be like drag, right? I think in drag, the drag performers, all the ones that I know, they realize what they're doing. They're in control of the image they're creating. They know how people are going to respond to that image, and they know how to use the characters that they make to kind of exist in the world, right?
Absolutely.
And to some degree, I think that we do that in our everyday lives, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, what were you thinking?
No, I'm just agreeing.
Yeah, and so rounding off that thought, so I was thinking about like, oh, what are all the different ways that people are in relationship with their bodies in an attempt to create something for themselves. So I think, for example, if we think about kind of the obsession with like working out, what's that about? Is that about creating an internal experience? And by obsession, I don't mean to pathologize working out, but what I do mean to say is that a preoccupation with what my body looks like.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's, if I'm following, it's like these external things. I mean, especially living in this neighborhood, I have come to the conclusion that a lot of the things that motivated me to go to the gym at the time, or to want to go to the gym, is because of all of the people around. Like, because nobody was telling me I had to be this or I had to be that, but the images, what I saw, and what was being so readily acceptable. And so I wasn't spiritually sound, as they will, and so I bought into it. And then I thought I needed to go to the gym, or I needed to not eat all the time, or whatever. And boy, we're just screwed up.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that I can relate to, right? Like, for example, growing up, I had a lot of disordered eating, and to some degree, like as a sober person, I have to be very careful about my relationship to food. So yeah, yes, I do work out, but my motivations for working out these days, or eating differently these days, is very different from when I was younger, right? There was a time, for example, where I was obsessed with the idea of getting sexual attention from other men, right? And to some degree, that there is a part of me that does like enjoy getting attention, but I often question myself, like, what is that about?
Yeah.
Right? Like, what is it? Like, could I survive, for example, if I didn't get this kind of attention? I had a conversation with someone in the rooms recently, who's aging, who is like noticing that like they've started to bald, and that their body is not behaving the way that it used to. And they've been really anxious and super depressed about it. And one of the things he said was like, I didn't realize how much of my self-esteem was tied up with how other people saw me. Right. And so, I think to myself, like, is it possible to have self-esteem if I'm not constantly being affirmed by the external world, right? Because it doesn't, like, I do this a lot less with like my body these days, but I've done it in other ways. Like, growing up, I was so craved for attention, and I knew I would get attention if I did really well academically, or if I got into like a lot of different leadership positions, like I'd get praise from people around me, right? And so much of the things that I was doing was about creating something for the world to respond favorably to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, like, it comes down to a lot of things, like constantly having to check my motivation for things. Like, to the question, like, can I have self-esteem? Can I have self-esteem without those external? Thing about it is, I say I'm going to the gym for my health. I'm doing this for my health or whatever. And all of a sudden I start looking good. And then people start commenting or whatever. I feel like I've constantly got to be checking my motives for what I'm doing. Like, I think it's possible to have it, but I think it's really important that, like, the two, it's interesting because it's like the two almost go hand in hand. Like, I do good for my body, people are going to acknowledge it. And there's nothing wrong with wanting that, it's like a reassurance. You just have to
there's
be,
nothing wrong with wanting to be attractive.
yeah, exactly.
Absolutely no.
You just have to be attractive for yourself. It's like I'm all, yeah.
I think so. In part, I think the first part of that is like seeing it for what it is.
Yeah.
Right. Like, one of the things that I really appreciate about recovery is developing self-esteem. Right. We talk about, in order to have self-esteem, we have to do esteemable acts. Right. And what I've noticed is that when I'm actually actively engaged with doing things that are not about me, right? If I'm volunteering or if I'm being of service in another way, I notice that like how I feel about myself actually is being inspired kind of like internally. I'm not necessarily looking for the world to tell me anything. I'm having these like unique experiences with people. And in fact, actually when I'm like connecting, having sincere connections with other people, really kind of everything else feels secondary.
Absolutely. I think that the work that we do in recovery, in 12 steps specifically, I feel like we're working we're like tech and we're working at in the falls into place. Like when I am constantly in, thinking about like, well, not, I won't say it, I'm constantly thinking about me, but thinking about ways that I can think about ways that I can improve me, or that I can address the issues that are before me, like anxiety, other things like that. It benefits me. And then other areas that I thought need to be addressed in certain ways don't need to, because they're addressed because I'm dealing with, I'm gaining my self-esteem, I'm gaining my self-confidence and me back, because I'm working on areas that were lost. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I get that. Can we reverse a little bit and talk about anxiety a little bit?
Oh yeah.
So when you experience anxiety, where do you experience that in your body?
I will experience it around here and
in your chest,
in my
for
chest,
people who will be listening.
Yeah, sorry. It's like in my chest. I was rubbing my chest. I'm all, ooh. Yeah, I feel it in my chest because it shows up. My anxiety attacks shows up where it becomes a struggle to breathe. And I think that one of the fears that I've always had was like suffocation. And I don't know. I was talking about that with my sponsor today about anxiety and how it shows up. And it shows up so kind of haphazardly. It comes in and whatever. But the thing is, I have to address it now because it's kind of affecting how I think about things like travel and other things, because I'm oh my God. You know how when you have memories of the anxiety, and every time I'm in a situation like that, I think it's going to come back. And I don't know if it's actual real or if it's just 100%. Of my creation. So it's like, yeah,
absolutely. I think
that's another show, because I got to talk about anxiety.
Anxiety, maybe, yeah. Because I wanted to talk a little bit about anxiety too. Like I experience anxiety also in my chest, and what's interesting to me is I've been actively working on addressing my anxiety, like separating the actual physical sensation of anxiety from like the narrative that's generally attached to it. And what I'm noticing is that as I am like breathing more into that anxiety, or I'm being more open with people about that anxiety. Like for example, yesterday, I called a mutual friend of ours, and I was like really anxious about something, and my like thoughts were spinning, and I was talking to them, and I started sobbing during the call. And I didn't realize that that's actually what I needed. I needed to have the physical sensation of actually getting something outside of myself, getting it out of me. Right. And I think the way that this relates to body image issues is because I noticed that sometimes some of my fears and my anxieties have to do with judging my body. Sometimes it's like one of the major reasons why I don't like social media is because I'm constantly being fucking bombarded with all these different types of bodies, and I start to compare myself, or I start to see all of these different lives being lived. And like what's crazy is that like I'm an educated person, like this is my wheelhouse. I'm in the profession of like mental health, and even then, these messages kind of like they slowly kind of seep in, and before I know it, I'm like, why do I fucking hate myself? Or like, or why do I feel envious or jealous? And so part of like my healing around like comparing my body to other bodies has been one, like figuring out, like one is like silencing the noise around that, right? Because the anxiety originates in most cases in like the thought patterns, right? So it's been like getting like meditating, being honest with like friends about like the kind of thoughts that I've been having, right? And then the other part of that has been like sitting with what's actually happening inside of me physically and being kind and like breathing through um all of that.
That's really heavy. Like I think in what you said, what I feel like the gift that we have now that we have, you know, we're clear of substances and what have you, is getting to a place where we're able to be honest about what it is. Because I think, like with our feelings about our body and whatever, and even anxiety, there's shame
Oh
around it.
gosh, yeah.
Like what I find, like when I'm experiencing these anxiety attacks, what is most frustrating is the fact that it's not a tangible thing that someone can see. So a lot of times it's like folks have either dismissed it as nothing. Like an example is like I struggle with, like, when I get onto the plane, when the door closes. It doesn't happen all the time. I have little tricks that I do, but sometimes that my anxiety takes off, and then I stand up and usually it's like, okay, I have this momentary thought, like, do I get off and catch another flight or not go? And I know that it's going to pass, but it doesn't feel like when I'm in it. And one of the tricks that I have, if I haven't taken a couple of Benadryls just to quiet my head, I get up and I walk the aisle, or I stand, and I've seen, or at least I felt like I've seen a reaction from folks, and that is just the worst and the loneliest and the most discomfort that I feel. And it makes me question whether or not, it makes me think about it. Like every time I think about travel and things like that, I think about it in those terms.
So that's you said some really important stuff there. And I think one of the things that you said that I'm relating to is I know it's going to leave, although in the moment it doesn't feel like it's going to leave. Right. Can you remember the first time when you actually had the experience that proved to you that it was going to shift? Because I'm thinking for myself, you know, the hardest thing for me, So like I think about, for example, let's comparing my body to other bodies, right?
Mhm.
I can remember being a teenager. So I grew up in like in a pretty affluent area, and there were a lot of white people. And I can remember growing up and like hating myself.
Mhm.
Like I didn't look like all the guys around me, and all the guys around me were like blonde and blue-eyed, and like their bodies looked different than mine. And I'm telling you, I can remember hating my body. And I remember this one time I came out when I was really young. I was 14 years old, and I was involved in this young gay youth group. And I can remember there was this one guy who came in who like basically looked like every gay boy I've ever seen in like a magazine, and everyone was obsessed with him and everyone talked about him. And I can remember leaving that room and crying because I was like, oh my God, it's being confirmed for me. You know what I mean? And that to me is so tricky, because it's interesting, because on one end I'm like, oh, I want to be fawned over.
Yeah.
I want to look like this person, or is it that I want this kind of attention, and like, why do I want this kind of attention? And so much of that is like tied up in that, right? There's like internalized racism there. There's like the erotic life of racism. There's like the sexualization of bodies, and what bodies get to be sexualized,
Yeah.
right? Like, is being sexualized a privilege? And, you know, we talk a lot about, for example, preferences, right?
Yeah.
I hear that. There was this great talk I went to many years ago. It was called The Erotic Life of Racism. It was being hosted at Berkeley Law. And they were talking about how people talked about preferences. Well, I just prefer white men, or, you know, I prefer X, Y, and Z, right? And that it's not racist because it's just a preference.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, I think I may have shared this before. I remember it was probably before I started working with the Black sponsor that I had at the time, when I needed to go some stuff. I was struggling with me and my own identity. And I remember getting out of the shower, and I wiped the all dramatic. I wiped the kind of condensation from the mirror and whatever, and I asked myself the question: am I judging me as value worthy based on me, or am I doing that based on me as a black man? Am I looking in there and am I seeing a person who is not, who I don't feel is desirable because I'm a black man, or am I, and it was, I almost feel like that was the beginning of my journey. That was really the beginning. Like I'm all thinking, what messages, what kind of narrative am I getting that is causing me to kind of not feel comfortable in my skin?
Right. I was thinking about, for example, like for the longest time, you'd see things like on people's profiles that said like no fats, no femmes,
Mm-hmm.
right? And which it's problematic for a bunch of different reasons. But I was thinking about kind of like the transition of like the change of beauty standards, right?
Yeah.
Like what we call beautiful today is not necessarily what was called literally like 60 years ago. Like these things are constantly morphing. And so one of the things that like I've said before is that beauty standards are selected for, right? Like these are things that are kind of molded culturally over time. And there are actually very few things that are universal. I think one of the kind of the universal things is like signs of health. Signs of health kind of translate across like the universe, like I'm sorry, the country. I don't know what people are doing on Mars, but you know what I mean? Like the universe. But you talked about, I think the subtext of one of the things you were saying was like inherent value, right? So can you say a little bit about that? Like, what have you done to kind of get to a place where you've like, I actually have inherent value? Is that a heavy question?
No.
Should we come back to it?
Well, I don't think it's there are a number of steps, and there are a number of steps, and along with those steps, time. Like it's kind of constantly putting, like I found myself at one point like without knowing, I made it a point to surround myself with other people of color.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not I was running from or avoiding, it's like kind of like turning off the TV or turning off social media.
Mm-hmm.
These were things that I was being exposed with, and things that were challenging me, and things that were causing me discomfort. So I needed to kind of step away and put myself in situations and scenarios, like allowing myself to be around people who valued me, who showed me through their actions and through their words that I mattered, and not kind of letting this voice in my head be louder, because it wasn't that the people, the non people of color that I was around were telling me at all. Maybe they were just, it was through their actions, because that's how we learn. Everybody was on the same bullshit kind of cycle where just like you said, the one individual that was the standard or whatever, whatever, I constantly seeing those things, so I was avoiding being around those things and surrounding myself with people of other colors and cultures that I deemed beautiful, and really kind of trying to living in that, and
I love that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I think about is like, I think about like, what am I feeding myself?
Yeah.
Right. So there was, for example, a time when I did have social media where like I would follow like every thirst trap, right? Like there's, like I tend to kind of have a type, and I would like only follow guys who fit into that type.
Mm-hmm.
And then I noticed like, it was weird. I think there's maybe like a different experience for gay men, but I'll speak for myself, because like as a gay man, I have the option of being with that other man, or I can compare myself to that other man, or I can tell myself, do I want to be him? Yeah. Do I hate him? Do I love him? Yeah, right? Like it gets really complicated. I don't know. I can't see that being the same for like heterosexual couples. Like, I don't know that there's like,
but it probably is.
Yeah, probably some version of it.
Yeah. You know how we have little mantras. I used to tell myself, like, just because there are folks who are interested in me that I'm not interested in them. I have to pay attention to that. Meaning, just because somebody is not into me doesn't mean that I'm not desirable. I heard that message somewhere, and I That's something that I hold on to all the time. Just because that person's not into me does not mean that I'm not worthy of being loved or whatever. It just means that that person is not into me. And
Yeah.
I don't do it perfectly, but I was gonna make this comment. So the whole thing with preferences and profile. I remember one time I was so annoyed with all that I changed my profile. I said, I'm really looking for exotic people. I'm not into pasty white. I used counter language because I was just so angry, and that's just as bad, because I was like, what I've learned or what I appreciate is like, you can have preferences as much as you want to. You don't have to post them. And I was thinking that to me is privilege, that you get to say, I don't want this, 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 and that, because I would just block everybody. It's like, come on, if you give me a list of what you don't want. And the worst was, I'm sorry, this is a detour. You got all this stuff in there, and then you send me a message. What is that telling me? That I'm your consolation. And I decided I ain't nobody's consolation. If you told me that you're not really into black guys, good. Thank you. Why did you send me a message? Because I'm black.
Right.
I'm black as night, like the comic book. Okay.
Yeah.
For people who can't see me, I'm black.
So for people who can't see me, but so I want to kind of like shift this a little bit.
I love it. He's shifted, baby.
So I want to shift it a little bit, and I think part of one of the things that I like about where I'm at now these days is that I've had the experience of people who are like in their power, right? I hate to use this kind of language, but they're in their power, but they aren't trying to take anything from anyone else.
Absolutely.
Right. So these are people, for example, who, like they look great or they have wonderful lives, but these are people who are not doing it at the expense of everyone else. These are not people who are only exclusively talking to one type of person, right? These are people who have all types of friends, or they keep all kinds of company, etc. And what I realized, and that is like, my sense is that in my own experience, that when I am feeling good with myself, when I'm right with myself, like I find that I actually feel like more open-minded, and I feel more adventurous, and I feel more like welcoming. And the other thing I notice is that like the more I love the people around me, there is this kind of dying away of the body, which is really interesting, which is, I also, again, like I don't want to talk about the body like it's this bad thing. But the positives around this have been like,
or maybe the obsession with the body.
Yeah, like the obsession and the comparisons with the body.
And that's so right. I mean, I think that we get that. It's like, I have so many people in my life right now that I absolutely love and adore, and I know that they love and adore me, and I don't stress. Like when I closed my membership, and I decided no longer to pay a fat tax, especially since I wasn't really taking action to make those changes. I had to get right with like what was going on. And it was easy because I've got all these people around me who love me and accept me, or maybe they just set me as fat. We wouldn't know how to handle it. Go ahead.
But yeah, well, I think like part of that is, I'm mindful of like my tone here, and I don't mean to like imply or suggest that like that there are all these things out body or being in a body. What I am trying to kind of very complicated.
Oh yeah.
And that in relationships with bodies being complicated, that there are ways of enjoying and finding peace inside of your body, either looking at it or being like living inside of it.
Peace inside but somebody else's body.
Yeah. And that'll be our next episode.
Yeah.
But so let's talk about that. So like, what are maybe some things that you've done that have helped you feel good about yourself?
Getting sober.
Yeah. Okay.
Getting sober and doing the work to get to know me. I think that a lot of me before, I was kind of what we're talking about. I was living for other people. I was judging myself based on how other people were showing up, or how and making I think that coming out was the beginning. Like we talked about kind of earlier, where you were feeling a little uptight. Was that off air?
Yeah. No, I think that was on air. Like when you went in.
Yeah, it was. And when I went in, exactly, it was the beginning of me changing that part of me, was getting honest with who I was, and getting on it. That, I mean, I feel like that saved me, especially through the darkest time of my depression and my addiction, was that piece of me being a gay man, or identifying a gay man, because it was the only identity I had, or at least that I was owning up to.
Yeah, I feel like one of the things that, like, just across the board, like one of the kind of ways that like addiction, or like the disease of addiction, comes up for me is like the feeling of not being enough, just in general, like. And what has helped me out of that has been, like, in all things that I do, and this is a kind of, with everything that I do, I try to do it in the service of God and the service of other people, right? I remember years ago, so I've shared about this before. My sponsor's very healthy. She's much older and she still looks great. And I remember years ago asking her, like, how is it that you do this? And she said, like, I don't do it for myself. Like, I do it in service of being healthy so that I can be of service to other people, And it's the same thing with my research. It's like, I could approach my research as like someone who's like looking to win awards, or I can sincerely think about my research as work that's going to actually help other people.
That is so true. Like when I talk to people about me doing drag and what have you, it's like, I'm not interested in doing drag at bars and whatever. Not that there's anything wrong. You can do drag however you want to. But I realize that when I do it for the recovery community, when I do it like that, and I do it for the people in the audience because I love them, it's like I get so much more from that experience. So it's like when I apply that to other areas, it's like, if my motivation, again, back to motivation, if my motivation is on point, then, I find more success in the things that I'm like kind of attempting.
Yeah, I think, when I think about recovery, like if that's like one of the things that defines it for me, is that living a sober life, a life that's centered in recovery, in this case, like the 12 steps and with the idea of serving a higher power. That to me is the defining characteristic in a lot of ways. It's a life that isn't selfish, right? It's a life that really is about bettering the lives of other people. And to be short, it's not about like being a doormat. It's not about helping others at the expense of myself, but it's about finding joy and connecting with other people. And I really think, like, across the board, literally across the board, that is when I'm happiest. I'm happiest.
Beautiful paradox.
Yeah, it's this like, it is a paradox. Yeah, it's like everything, like I think about, like, when I change my relationship to food, and I change my relationship to working out, and I change my relationship to sex and intimacy, or meetings, or like, you name it, like like academic or professional like endeavors. When I change my relationship kind of singularly about like serving God or living my life's purpose through these things, all of that started to shift for me.
This ties to like our a while back we talked about the only thing you have to change is everything.
Right.
What you said, when I change my relationship to it, it's not that I have to change it, I have to change my relationship to it.
Right. And when I wake up in the morning and I say, like, God, use me to do your work, right? Like, everything that comes after that, if that is the spirit in which I'm approaching my life, right, there really is no room there for me to kind of turn. I mean, I'm a human, right? So as a human, I'm gonna occasionally like
have moments
where
then you get
ego gets involved.
And you get to not beat yourself up senselessly when you have those moments, because you are human. I like to say that. I like to say, you know what, I'm human and therefore fallible, and I am going to have those moments. But the key is not to stay in those moments. I get to have them, but I don't stay in them.
Yeah, that is so tough. Maybe that needs to be the next episode. Is like, why is Anthony so uptight?
No.
I'm not saying that's what you're saying.
No, the next episode should be, why is Anthony so self-centered? It's like, why is Anthony so this, that?
But yeah, I mean, that is like, in general, that is, it's something that I've been working on. It's like, I'm
You
wound
always-
so tight.
I love it. You always give me these wonderful sound bites.
So Bonnie Violet will like clip it and show it to the world, and the world will be like, Anthony believes he's uptight. But that's certainly something that like that's certainly something I've been working on, right? Like related to my body or not at all, is just like I am wound so tight, you know. And I think a lot of the things that I'm wound tight around, they've been really protective. You know, a lot of it has been around like, how do I protect myself from being hurt by other people or the world, or like, and really it's about like, how can I make it safe to be in my mind and in my body? And I think like, you know, the beginning of that is like learning to kind of untangle, you know, loosen up. And, you know, I feel like I've been on this quote unquote journey for like the last year and a half. And part of that has been like establishing friendships with people that I typically wouldn't hang out with.
Absolutely. Are you saying you wouldn't normally hang out with me?
That's not what I said.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have a comment before we start wrapping things up. Anka writes, I really started working on self-compassion as I age, and my outside self is no longer shiny and sparkly like I was before. Ageism is real, and our culture glorifies youth and beauty.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you, Anka.
Honestly, I've been thinking about like my life in relation to the fact that like I'm 52 years old, I'm gonna be 53, and I'm thinking instead of spending time thinking that I get to move forward, I'm thinking, oh God, I've used up the time and nothing good's going to come from it. And the only way that I get out of it is when I see amazing people who are older and living and doing the things that I want to do and doing them now. You know, how sometimes we start our lives a little later. Yeah, it's like,
you know, one of the things and we can start wrapping up the visual part of the podcast. But one of the things that I really appreciate is people who are aging gracefully. And the way I interpret that is by people who they like take care of themselves, right? Like for example, I'm treading lightly here because I don't want to say anything that's like offensive accidentally, but I'm thinking here, for example, is like I know some older gay men in my life, and like they talk a lot about like how they just feel invisible and they feel ugly and undesirable, and you know, at the same time, these are like people who generally like don't take care of themselves.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not saying like you have to go to the gym 5 days a week. I'm not saying any of that, but I'm thinking about like they don't take care of themselves like spiritually.
Yeah.
Or
like take advantage of the like. Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Right. And so but then there's some people that I know in the program who are older and like they're effervescent. You know what I mean? They like they're so captivating,
flawless.
Right. Like, and it isn't because they're doing anything extraordinary, but it's because it's clear to me that these people have really loving relationships with themselves.
Exactly.
You know, and these are people who I've experienced who are like gracious to other people. You know what I mean? Who like, they're just kind, you know, they're kind and compassionate.
I have an image of that one person, but I
think we're talking about the same person.
I have an image and I'm like, yeah, exactly.
Oh, you said him. I'm thinking of a her.
I'm thinking there's
a lot of
there's a him and a her. There's a bunch of him and her.
There's a bunch of them. And
there's a him and a her.
And I think like that's one of the things too, is that like we all have to age.
We do.
Like we all have to age, and we have to live in these bodies until we die.
Yeah.
And so like, how can we live in our bodies until we die and be okay? You know what I mean? And feel happy and content and fulfilled.
I don't know. I'm sorry that we're leaving this visual part of this on such a downer.
It doesn't.
How do we live in these bodies then?
But I feel like we've answered that question a few ways. I've talked about being of service. I've talked about.
Yeah, we don't just go to sleep. We wake up and we do the work that we're doing now. I mean, I think that we talk about it. We don't encourage you today at all. If you're feeling it, talk about it. Find some trusting person, because I think that is so important, to have somebody who can relate or write it down or whatever. Don't hold on to it, because the shame that's in that is kind of the shame that will really do us in.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that, Louis.
I just had to say, because I was feeling something. I had a moment.
Yeah, my sponsor always says it's better to say it out than to think it in, right? And maybe that's a conversation that you start with, like your concept of a power that's greater than yourself. If you don't have a God, find a God. If you're an atheist, find something that's bigger than you. It's a good place to start, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.